In this video, we're going to be discussing the person of Cain, found in Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 to 16. Well, what precedes this story in Genesis chapter 4? It's the rebellion of Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3. And because of their rebellion of eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they are thrown out of the garden and dwell east of Eden in Genesis 3, verse 24. And we see in Genesis 4, verses 1 to 16, which is the story of Cain and Abel, the direct result of the fall, the direct result of Adam and Eve rebelling against God. And we see what life outside of Eden looks like, life outside of knowing the Lord. In Genesis 2, verse 17, the result of the rebellion of Adam and Eve would that there would be death. And we see this death in Genesis chapter 4. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, Cain is born. And he's called Cain because I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And the word Cain sounds similar to I have gotten help, or I have acquired. In 4 verse 2, Abel is born. And note in Genesis 4, Abel is almost always described when he's mentioned as the brother of Cain. So Cain, and he has a brother. His brother is Abel. And this is to highlight, actually, when you look at all these references, there's numerous of them in chapter 4, it's to highlight that this murder is extremely violent. Cain is so violent that he even murders his own brother, his own blood. Cain is described as a tiller of the ground here in Genesis 4. Now, there's nothing wrong with farming. In fact, that same word, tiller of the ground, is used in Genesis chapter 2, verse 5, and Genesis 2:15, and that's the command that God gives to Adam and what he's to carry out in the garden. Cain offers an offering to God in Genesis chapter 4, verse 3. Fruit from the ground. It's an acceptable offering because this word gift that is used in Genesis 4 verse 3 is often used with the gifts that are to be given in the book of Leviticus, Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In 4 verse 4, Abel is described as a shepherd. He keeps sheep, he keeps flocks, and he offers fat portions to the Lord. Now, fat portions were offerings that were to be given to the Lord, and we see that in Leviticus 3:16, all the fat is the Lord's. But since Cain and Abel both offer offers that would appear to be good before the Lord, why is Cain's offering rejected in Genesis 4? Because Cain is a violent sinner and a rebel against the Lord. Cain is also rejected, as we see in Genesis 4, verse 4 to 5, by God. We see that. The Lord does not accept the offering of Cain, and yet the Lord does accept the offering of Abel. In the ESV, it says that the Lord has no regard for the offering of Cain. But also in Genesis, we see that the younger child in the family is often chosen as the promised one ahead of the older child. And we see this actually traced all throughout Genesis. Jacob is chosen. He's the younger one. Esau is rejected. Joseph is chosen, even though he's the second youngest son. And Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, the younger son, Ephraim, is chosen and receives the blessing in Genesis 48, verse 19. The Lord knows the heart of Cain. The Lord knows that Cain is a violent rebel against God. And actually, the Lord confronts Cain in Genesis 4, 6 to 7. He confronts his anger. Cain goes from unacceptable worship because his heart is not right with God to anger, and then he goes to murder. And God says that sin has desire for Cain. Cain is a rebel against God, and we see that here, that he's a grave rebel. Although Abel is the brother of Cain, this doesn't stop Cain. Cain murders his brother. There's that phrase again, his brother. And now in Genesis chapter 4, verses 9 to 16, God confronts and punishes Cain because of his sin. God confronts Cain and asks, "Where is your brother? Where is Abel?" This is actually very similar to how God confronts Adam and Eve in the garden. "Where are you? Now, where is your brother?" Cain offers an excuse. "Who am I, my brother's keeper?" Cain tries to pass the buck. His brother is not his responsibility. Just like Adam and Eve, when they're confronted by God for their rebellion against him, they pass the buck. The man blames the woman. The woman blames the serpent. This is blame game here going on. This is what Cain does too. And we see a similar relation between the result of the fall of Adam and Eve and the result of the rebellion of Cain. In 4 verse 11, the ground is cursed. In Genesis 3:17, it says a similar thing. And we see the outcome of the rebellion of Cain and his wickedness is the same outcome of Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve dwell east of Eden. Cain, because of his rebellion, dwells east of Eden. But even in this story where we see violence, murder, even God's judgment, we see the hope of the gospel. First, we see that later on in Genesis that a son is born to Adam and Eve, and he is Seth. And this points to God's provision of salvation in a godly line of people. But above all, this points us to the provision and the need of Jesus Christ. We as humans are really no better than Cain. We might not murder, but we still have murderous, arrogant, prideful, greedy thoughts in our heart. And maybe we've never even thought of murdering. But in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 to 26, hate is breaking the 6th commandment. If we've hated someone, we've already broken the sin of murder in our heart. And that is why Jesus Christ came. Jesus Christ came to deal with our sin of hate, our sin of murder, our sin of arrogance, our sin of pride, our sin of rebellion against God. He took the punishment of God in our place because God is a holy God. He hates sin. But Jesus Christ bore that anger of God in our place so that those who would receive grace, like Abel did, like Seth did, can experience God's blessing, forgiveness of sins, sins wiped away, and they can have the hope of eternal life. Cain is actually mentioned in the New Testament in the letter of 1 John. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 12, it says, "We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother." And why did he murder? Because his own deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. The story of Cain also calls us believers to live holy and godly lives, giving all our glory with our lives and praise to the Lord alone. Thanks for watching, and God bless.